What's up guys, I'm Brad Rodriguez from Fix This Build That, and today I want to show you how I made this resin and wood bowl. I used cherry segments and epoxy rings. I had some hiccups along the way, but I'll show you how I fixed them and made it work. Stay tuned, I'll show you just how I did it. This is my first time turning a bowl on the lathe, and I started this project out with this cherry 4x4 that I've been wanting to use. Now it had some defects in it, so I decided to mill it down into thinner boards for my bowl. To resaw the board, I needed two adjacent flat sides, and I got those on the joiner. I set up my bandsaw for resawing, and then I used one flat face against the bandsaw fence and the other against the table, and ran the 4x4 through 3 times to get 4 boards out of it. This is a great way to get perfect grain matching in a project. Next, I cut off some of the bad parts of the boards on the miter saw and the table saw to get down to the usable stock. I finished off the rough milling at the planer and got my board smooth on both sides and at a consistent thickness. Now I designed this bowl to be made from 4 segmented wood rings and 3 epoxy rings. Spoiler, that didn't work. And I used an online tool to plan out my bowl. I'll link it below, but it told me exactly how wide to make each strip that I'd cut into the final segments. With each strip cut to size, I made a pencil line down one face and a marker line down one side of each board. Now this will help me keep the segments organized later. I'll be cutting the segments on my table saw, so I started by switching out to a fresh sacrificial fence on my miter gauge. Then I used a nifty setup block made specifically for cutting segments. I set one pin to the home location and the other to the number of segments that I wanted in each ring. It sets the angle of the miter gauge for perfect cuts with no math. It's pretty slick, I'll link to that below as well. I ran the miter gauge over the blade at this setting to see exactly where the blade would hit the miter fence. Then I clamped a stock block to the table saw fence and set up for my first segment cuts, using the numbers from the online tool. I ran a test piece through using my widest board for the base. And when making a solid base, you need each segment to come out to a sharp point. The first run was a little wide, so I adjusted the fence in a bit until it gave me that nice sharp point that I needed. Now cutting the segments is pretty easy. I just butted the board against the stop block, made the cut, then flipped the board over and repeated that until I had my 10 segments. Now since this was my first time doing segments, I wanted to glue up the base before cutting the rest to get a good feel for it. I used the marker and pencil lines to alternate the segments and help cancel out any variations in the cuts. Then I applied a liberal amount of glue to each piece, and using a wax piece of paper under the glue up will help keep your bench nice and clean too. To apply pressure, I used a hose clamp and tightened it down with my drill, and this little hack works really nicely. I felt pretty good about the process, so I went back to the table saw and I cut the segments for the other rings. Each ring going up the bowl gets wider, so the segments get progressively longer as well. Now, if you used more segments in the upper rings, then this wouldn't be true, but I used 10 segments for all the rings, so they will get wider as you go up. The glue for the rings is slightly trickier than the base, since there isn't a middle point to reference all the segments on. But I rubbed each piece together as I added it to the ring, and this helped hold everything together until I could get them all in place and clamp them again with a hose clamp. I repeated the process with the other rings, but I had to make a quick adjustment for the top one. The 7-inch hose clamp that I was using was just a bit too small, so to extend it, all you've got to do is disassemble 2 of them, then thread them back together into one larger ring. This is a great way to expand your clamping and not have to buy a ton of different sizes of these things either. Next I moved on to making the epoxy resin rings. Instead of making resin strips and cutting them into segments, I bought the silicone cake mold to make one-piece rings. I laid out a circle on a piece of 3/4 inch plywood to give me a 3/4 inch wide ring. I cut the circle to size on my bandsaw. It doesn't have to be super exact, I just got close to the line and freehanded it as best as I could. So I wanted a 3-inch thick ring when I finished, but how much epoxy did I need? I used the good old pi r squared equation to find the area of the base of the mold, then I subtracted the area of the wood circle. So this gave me the area of the ring, then all I had to do was multiply it by 1/2 inch to get the volume of the ring in cubic inches. Then I converted that to ounces, or milliliters for all of my metric friends, and I knew how much I needed. And hey, if you're new and you like what you're seeing so far, go ahead and subscribe, and ring that bell to make sure you get notifications for all my new uploads. Hope to see you around in the comments. To keep the epoxy from sticking to the wooden circle, I covered it in a sealant tape around the bottom and sides. Then I used hot glue to stick it to the bottom of the silicone mold. The pour was 4 ounces of resin, and I used a mixing cup and a 2-part epoxy to get the right mixture. Then I added in some blue pigment for coloring. I mixed the pigment in until all the clumpiness was gone and it was an even color. And after that, I poured the resin into the mold around the circle. I let the epoxy set up overnight, then I came back to remove it from the mold. It came out really nicely, but that wood circle in the middle was not so easy. I used a screwdriver and a chisel to loosen the bottom, and I was able to remove it in just a few minutes, so it wasn't too bad. And the metallic pigments left a cool design in the ring as it cured. I repeated the exact same process with a lighter blue pigment for the next ring. I think I like this lighter blue the best out of all the ones that I used. For the third and final epoxy ring, I cut a smaller wooden circle to make the inside of the ring smaller and the ring wider. This is going to allow me to have a sweep in the bowl and to transition easier between layers. I also figured out a much easier way to remove the wood circle from the epoxy ring. Using one of the wood segments to support the epoxy and knocking out the circle worked great. With the epoxy rings done, I pulled out the segmented wooden rings from the clamps. Then I rolled out my 1836 drum sander from Jet, the sponsor of today's video, and got to flattening all the rings. This thing is great for flattening delicate items like these epoxy rings, and it gets them all down to a consistent thickness. I ran the rings and the segments through, and I finished them off with a little hand sanding at a higher grit before the glue up. But at this point, I also realized my design plan had gone south. The top wooden ring was too large for a good transition to the largest epoxy ring size. And when I tried to stack the 3 epoxy rings together, it just did not look right. So I decided to pull one out, and I just went with 2 epoxy rings and 3 wood rings for the final design. To bring all the pieces together, I did a large glue up all at once. I used yellow glue for the wood-to-wood connection at the base, then I used epoxy for all the other layers. This was a little tricky since the epoxy just kind of slides around and it doesn't tack up quickly like the wood glue. But I got everything lined up and I clamped it all in place and it worked out. After the glue and epoxy was dry, I took it out of the clamps and it was looking pretty sweet. To turn the bowl, I'm attaching the blank to a faceplate on my lathe. So I cut a small block and I glued it to the bottom of the blank. Now this basically is just going to hold the screws from the faceplate and make sure everything stays put while I'm turning. I attached the faceplate to the bowl blank and mounted it on my lathe. The blank was definitely out of round, but luckily I've got the Jet 1221 VS lathe. It has variable speed and I can easily control and adjust for any vibration with a quick turn of the dial. I'll have a link down below where you can check out the Jet lathe and the drum sander. These are great machines and I really enjoy using them. I set the lathe to a little under 1000 RPM and I got my square radius carbide tool to do the roughing like I do for most of my turning projects when I start out. When I started on the bowl though, I quickly learned that turning epoxy is not like most turning projects. It chipped out like crazy. Look at these huge chunks that came out. I switched over to a round tool and I cranked the speed up to about 1350 RPM after a quick chat with Johnny Brook from Crafted Workshop, who did an epoxy bowl recently. Now this made all the difference in the world. The resin started shooting off in streams of these white ribbons. It was actually really fun to turn. It makes a huge mess, but it was definitely fun. I stopped and checked my progress, and this is exactly what I was looking for, a nice smooth finish. After roughing out the outside shape, I moved the tool rest and started working on the inside of the bowl. You'll notice I'm wearing a glove on my left hand, and that's to protect it from the epoxy shards and the fibers, which can really irritate your skin. But always be very careful whenever you're wearing a glove around a lathe, and make sure that your hand is firmly on the tool rest away from the bowl. I finished the inside shaping, then I went back to the outside to clean up the base of the bowl. Now after that, I was ready for sanding, and I worked my way up through the grits from 150 to 600. Then I came back with some micro mesh sanding pads and went all the way up to 3600 grit for a really nice finish. I'm using a water-based finish here on the bowl, and the epoxy really came to life when I started applying it. I put 5 coats on in total, sanding with micro mesh in between each one until I had a really nice sheen. And to remove the bowl from the lathe, I used a parting tool, and I cut right where I'd glued on that faceplate block. I finished it off with a handsaw so that the bowl wouldn't go shooting off and ruin all the work that I've already done. I cleaned up the bowl with a chisel, then I sanded it flat on a smooth surface, and I was done. Now, even though this wasn't my original design, I'm really happy with the outcome, and I learned a lot about segmented turning and turning epoxy. I love the shimmer of the epoxy and the way that the cherry segments complement the blue sparkle in the rings. Working with epoxy is a blast. Hey, if you love this video, I think you're gonna love that one too. Go check it out. I have another one queued up for you. If you're not subscribed to the channel already, I'd love to have you as part of the team. And until next time, guys, get out there and build something awesome.